Good evening, everyone. This is quite a good turnout for an evening where the England game's on, isn't it? Kat's already told me I've got to speed things up a bit. But I grew up in a family where we didn't watch any football, so I'm just going to take my time. But I'll be watching anyone who gets their phone out for a quick peek. So I noticed Pastor Dennis put up the theme for the prayer and fast not too long ago. You'll be pleased to know that 1 Corinthians chapter 2 is one of my favourite chapters in the Bible, and it also fits in quite nicely with this. So I was going to talk about people having preconceptions. It's one of those where you think sort of like, why am I talking about this? What can people take from it? I suppose it's one of those where it's a bit of a, maybe it'll help us understand how to talk to people a bit better about certain things, maybe help us see each other and ourselves in a different way as well. But I've noticed, looking back on my own upbringing, there's a lot of times where you decide that something's true, and a lot of it comes from your own thoughts or maybe the way other people's explain something, and then when you go back and you actually look at the source of truth again, you realize that it's not what you thought for all these years, and that can be quite frustrating. I'm sure we've all had things like that. And when you start to look at like atheists or non-believers, and they have all these debates, and maybe they debate you realize often that what they're talking about and what they think is true, again, is not even like true from the source. I'm amazed when I think about it that the Bible has been pretty much the same for so many centuries, in the same form, and yet still so many people believe ideas that come from, the ancient or the medieval world, and it's just been maybe rebranded today. And we know that a lot from things like people's views on salvation, like the idea that if you've led a good or a bad life, then that's all you need to be saved or condemned. And I mean, that idea comes back to ancient Egypt and the scales, and even things like the sinner's prayer, of course. One thing that I was convinced was true, and I think this came back to a particular sermon I once heard. I think it was the way the guy was explaining it, but it's the idea that essentially you're good, but then when you commit a sin, that means you're naughty in front of God now. You're on the naughty step, and you pray to Jesus for forgiveness. And obviously you have to do it genuinely. You can't just fake it. But then when you do that, it's like God's noticed that and he's put you back to the place of redeemed. And it's one of those where, as a child, you sort of think, that kind of makes sense. But then when you really look into it, there's a lot of things that really don't work. So it's like, if you've spent your whole life being good, and then you just committed one sin, and then Jesus came back, then it'd be like, nope, you're condemned now. Or if you'd done your whole life bad, and then you just prayed one prayer of forgiveness and Jesus came back, it'd be like, you're a good guy, and the other guy who's been good is just a bad guy. But as I said, that was something I sort of imagined to be the case. It's quite scary when you get so convinced of things like that. I don't know if anyone's heard of the idea of the Mandela effect. This comes back to because Nelson Mandela was big in like the 80s, and he was in prison, of course. But then when he died about 20, 30 years later, a lot of people came forward and they said, we thought he died in the 80s. And what they noticed was it was such a massive collective of people. And they were so convinced of this. Some people even started to take it as far as saying that they thought they'd lived in like an alternative timeline where Nelson Mandela had actually died in the 80s. And then they'd switched to this timeline where he'd been alive all this time. But it's just another way of saying a lot of people can be wrong at the same time. It's like another big example you see around is a lot of people were amazed when they found out that the Monopoly man wasn't wearing a monocle. For all those years, he had no monocle, and so many people apparently had convinced themselves together that he always had. One example in the Bible, just a little example, nothing of any real significance, but it's if you look back in Genesis, when Noah sends out the birds to check if there's any land, it's always depicted as the dove coming back with the olive branch. But if you read the text, it says it comes back with an olive leaf. And maybe part of the reason is because when you're drawing a logo or something of a bird, it's a lot easier to depict that as a branch. It's a lot more clear what it is if it's just got a leaf. Maybe it's a lot more confusing, I don't know. But it's just fascinating to see, I suppose, how easily people can be swept up in what's wrong, and it's kind of scary sometimes. And it's even more so when people who don't believe are, you might be trying to convince them of things that are true, but people have added to the Word of God so much that what they think the Bible says is actually not real. One thing I particularly want to bring up, and it sort of goes back into people thinking what's fair and what's not fair, I suppose, is the idea of original sin. Because this is another one where a lot of people get, I suppose, confused about this, and they argue about it because at the end of the day, it comes back to the idea that we have almost been punished for something that we didn't ourselves do. And the Bible itself says that we will not be punished for the sins of our forefathers. So some people take that as a bit of a contradiction. And again, it's one of those things where you can take things that are on the surface and you can believe it, but when you start to look deeper, it's one of those things where, especially if you don't have the Holy Spirit to teach you, it can bring up a lot of confusions. Again, the idea of being punished for something that we ourselves did not commit. The other thing is, so we are essentially... Okay, I'll take that back. The question is, why would Jesus, in other words, God, sacrifice himself to save us from his own wrath when he could create us not to sin, in a sense? And people work these kind of things around. Because again, it's like when you look back at Adam and Eve, God placed them in this place. He told them not to sin, but then the tree was right there and then. So when they sinned, it's like sin was brought into the world, and so we're born, and we're all just sinful. So I can understand why people have trouble believing that, and they think it's unfair. And it's one of those things which, again, the more you look into the Bible, is when you start to really see things, see what God's truth is meant to be, I suppose. If we turn to Proverbs 16, I'll just read a couple of Proverbs which are essentially the same thing. So chapter 16, verse 2. It says, "All the ways of a man are clean in his own eyes, but the Lord weighs the spirits." And again, if you look at Proverbs 21, verse 2, it says something very similar, which is, "Every way of a man is right in his own eyes, but the Lord ponders the heart." And when I was thinking about this, one thing I noticed, because I suppose it takes me back to that thing I said before about what I believed like salvation was. And it felt like unless you sinned, you were essentially good. And a lot of people carry this idea that they are good as long as they don't commit acts of evil. And what it sounds like the Bible is saying, in some senses, is that in general, people want to do what's right rather than what's wrong. And that does give me a certain measure of hope. But of course, it depends what standard they have of right and wrong. Because we can want to do what's right, but if we have the wrong standard, then we're never going to do what's right ultimately. Because it's a very old question of like, is man naturally good or is man naturally evil? And then it's like, the big question of, is evil the opposite of good, or is good the opposite of evil? Are we evil because we don't do bad, or evil because we commit acts of evil? And when you look at a lot of atheist thinking, they are generally convinced that humans are good. And it's what humans have created, like structures and religions and things, that have brought evil upon the earth. But of course, we all know that we can all empathize with a certain level of failure. And in many respects, it is that failure and that weakness that makes us human. It's only, in a sense, actually, when we are really evil that we think we are completely perfect. Because the other thing is, when we actually look at Christianity as a whole, some people treat it as, battles between things like angels and monsters and demons and things. But at the end of the day, so much of Christianity in the New Testament comes back to the battlefield of the self and of the mind. I just want to turn to Judges chapter 11. So this is the story of a guy called Jephthah, who was a judge, and he appears in Hebrews 11 as well, in the Hall of Fame of Faith. So right from the beginning, in verse 1, it talks about how this man was a mighty man of valor. So the Bible, right from the beginning, it sees him as a pretty good guy. And the point is that he basically takes on the role of judge and the leader of the army to then fight the enemies, the Ammonites. And we read in verse 29 as well, it says, "The Spirit of the Lord came upon Jephthah. He passed over Gilead, and Manasseh passed yeah, so a bit of extra. I'll just stop there. But what we see is, so he is, a man who's empowered by the Spirit of the Lord as well. So the Lord has chosen him, the Lord has given him this job. But as we read on, it says, "And Jephthah vowed a vow unto the Lord, and said, If thou shalt without fail deliver the children of Ammon unto mine hands, then it shall be that whatsoever comes forth of the doors of my house to meet me, when I return in peace from the children of Ammon, shall surely be the Lord's, and I will offer it up as a burnt offering." Now, on one side, you kind of think, this is good. He's saying, I'll give everything to the Lord, whatever it is. I'll give a gift. But then, of course, when you get to verse 34, it says, "And Jephthah came to Mizpah unto his house, and behold, his daughter came out to meet him with timbrels and dances, and she was his only child. Beside her he had neither son nor daughter. And it came to pass when he saw her, that he rent his clothes and said, Alas, my daughter, thou hast brought me very low, and thou art one of them that trouble me, for I have opened my mouth unto the Lord, and I cannot go back." So, of course, he ends up having to sacrifice his own daughter, which, of course, is, not a nice thing to happen. But it makes me wonder, how much is sin a product of our own weakness and our limitations, rather than because we actually, go out and choose evil? Because at the end of the day, this guy wanted to do something nice, and it was he almost became a victim of circumstance in a way. But obviously in the New Testament, Jesus does warn us about making promises and vows which, we won't want to commit to. So obviously on one side, he's being a bit stupid. But at the same time, our limitations and our weaknesses, we can't see the end of all our actions. So we can try to do the right thing, but it's only God who has the all-seeing wisdom that he can actually see the end of all of his actions, and therefore he's the only one that can truly be good with everything he does. And that in itself is another thing to prove and back up just how important having the Holy Spirit is. Because at the end of the day, we can have all of our own preconceptions and our understandings, but it's only when we have God within us, being able to work with us and show us the way, that we can truly be good. Another example, of course, is David with Bathsheba. Because, I don't think anyone can say that what he did there was a good thing in a sense, or good intentions like with Jephthah. But I do find it very interesting that pretty much the next day when Nathan the prophet comes to him and he explains and lays out what he's done, David instantly repents, because he understands exactly the difference between good and evil of the situation. But as soon as he puts himself in the situation and he understands what's happened and the result of that, that's when he knows he's the problem and instantly repents to the Lord. If we just skip back to Proverbs. Proverbs chapter 12. So in verse 15, it says, "The way of a fool is right in his own eyes, but he that hearkens to counsel is wise." And again, if you turn to chapter 3, verse 7, It says, "Be not wise in thine own eyes, fear the Lord and depart from evil." So this is explicitly a warning against seeing ourselves as always good and seeing ourselves as always understanding, because at the end of the day, as I said, we are limited and we can't understand everything. We can't work out everything on our own. And really, as soon as we just constantly get stuck in our own mind, that is when things start to go downhill. And in many ways, the biggest evils that humans commit are when people are continuously stuck in themselves, and when they go to such great lengths to justify their actions that they end up justifying evil as good. The New Testament warns of that woe to those who call good evil and evil good. And that really links to trusting in our flesh. Of course, 1 Corinthians talks a lot about, and Romans talks a lot about the difference between walking in the flesh and after the Spirit. Again, without the Spirit of God, we can't hope to understand all truths. And what we see as well with a lot of things like atheism is that without trusting in God, we automatically end up putting things in place of God, whether that's ourselves, our own understanding, idols, heroes, footballers maybe. And that's when, again, that is when the real bad things start to happen. They say ignorance is bliss, don't they? But I think one thing that the Bible really pushes for is this need to seek understanding when it's important, but also to know when we don't need to seek for it. Because a lot of things God hasn't revealed to us, and He doesn't need us to know. And it's good to take a step back and to know when it's important to look and when it's important not to. Just turn back to Proverbs 13. Verse 13, it says, "Whoso despises the word shall be destroyed, but he that fears the commandment shall be rewarded. The law of the wise is a fountain of life, to depart from the snares of death. Good understanding gives favour, but the way of transgressors is hard. Every prudent man deals with knowledge, but a fool lays open his folly." So again, it sounds quite clear from this little passage that the Lord delights in us having understanding. And again, like in 1 Corinthians chapter 2, it talks about how the Spirit teaches all things. So knowledge is a very good thing. If we turn to Matthew, I'll just read a couple more scriptures from here and then we'll finish up. So Matthew chapter 18. Verse 1, it says, "At the same time came the disciples unto Jesus, saying, Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? And Jesus called a little child unto him, and set him in the midst of them, and said, Verily I say unto you, except ye be converted and become as little children, ye shall not enter the kingdom of heaven. Whosoever therefore shall humble himself as this little child, the same is greatest in the kingdom of heaven." I like the idea that the disciples just asked this question and they were almost competing amongst each other. And in some ways actually talking like children. And then the Lord kind of ignores them and brushes them off a bit and says, you need to behave like this other person. But Yeah, I like this bit. I think it fits really well with this idea because adults generally they get to a point where we think we know everything we need to know, and children they have this genuine quality about them, and they're almost innocently ignorant in a sense because what they're constantly doing is they're just asking questions, and they trust the people they're asking enough to take it as truth. And when they hear the answers, they have constant wonder in everything. I feel like sometimes adults get to the point where we go beyond that, and a lot of adults seem to spend their lives being all miserable, and they're not, discovering new things about the world. But I love the fact that as a fellowship, we always have wonder about the Lord, and like when we give testimonies and when we see things like healings, everyone's really excited, and you could tell again there's almost a childish innocence about that. But of course, I don't believe for a second that the Bible is saying that we should be childish. Paul himself says that we should put away childish things. There's a difference between being innocently like a child and having wonder about the right things to being childish. I'll just finish in Matthew chapter 7. Verse 13 and 14. It says, "Enter ye in the strait gate. Wide is the gate, and broad is the way that leads to destruction. And many there are which go in thereat. Because strait is the gate, and narrow is the way which leads unto life. But few there be that find it." And this is another one where maybe when you're a bit younger and you don't understand it completely, you read it and think, this seems a bit unfair. Why would the way that is narrow be the one that is true and the one that's good, the one that the Lord's created for us to go down? But the reason I think this is such a good and poignant bit is, at the end of the day, truth is singular. It's right and it's good that there is one truth for us to go down, because that's the truth that the Lord has created. The way that's wrong is wide because there are a lot more lies than there are truths. And at the end of the day, if we are limited and there's so much that we don't understand, it is a lot more comforting to know that God has given us that singular truth and been clear about the way which is right, than expected us to just go off and find our own way, which a lot of people seem to think is the case. At the end of the day, we know how much we fail. We fail constantly on a daily basis. But it is a great comfort to know that God has made it really easy, and He's set out the path in His Word. So yeah, I think that's all. We'll have a prayer line now.